Welcome back to English Treasures, and today I'm going to be talking about our ancestors. A number of you sent me some questions, some really interesting ones actually, about the Anglo Saxon monarchies and realms, so I thought I'd pose a question today, and that is, who were the Anglo Saxons? And in the first of two videos, each of which will be about 19-20 minutes long, I'll try and answer that question for you. The Anglo-Saxons were, in short, a collection of European tribes who migrated to England, particularly from the 5th century onwards. They were tough, they were enterprising, and they were very skilled. They had a reputation for acts of savagery, but also they had finer qualities. The aspect of their character, particularly amongst the men, which stood the test of time, was their restless lust for fame, and they tended to live by their Anglo-Saxon motto, Dombith se last, which translates roughly to fame or glory, or perhaps reputation is everything. And typically they had an intense sense of loyalty to a chieftain, a leader, or a ring giver who would reward great deeds and acts of courage in adversity with rings or treasure, like that found at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk and Hammerwich in Staffordshire. Treasure was important to these people because it was physical evidence and confirmation of their esteem and status. Now, the Anglo-Saxon era began in earnest with 5th century migrations from Europe and ended 650 years later in 1066. But the influence of those people lasted far longer. The language of the Anglo-Saxon, often called Old English, evolved, of course, to become the world's premier language. And I don't want you to think of that ancient dialect as a different or foreign language. It was simply an early form of the English that is spoken and written today. The Anglo-Saxon era is well documented, and one can still read extracts from their contemporary texts. Their poets particularly recorded accounts of great deeds, which for centuries were recited or perhaps sung in their great mead halls. Now we know that until approximately 6000 BC, it was possible for migrants to walk from the continent into the east and southeast of England. When, of course, the sea levels rose, Britain became an island, and a unique British culture developed amongst the indigenous tribes that were already in the country. Then, between 1000 BC and 600 BC, European Celts began arriving and settling in this country, and smaller migrations of different races and cultures continued for centuries after that, but usually in relatively small numbers. Anyway, the first really significant event in our history began in AD 43, when the Romans successfully invaded and began their program of colonisation in Britain. The Roman occupation was set for nearly 4 centuries, and as we know, they built roads and fortifications, but often following the same routes and on the same sites that had been occupied by earlier inhabitants, so there was a continuity. The legions faced occasional resistance, and by the year AD 410, as the Roman Empire came under attack all across Europe, their armies began to withdraw from Britain, and by August of that year, most of them had left. There's very little evidence of what happened during this period of our history, which is why it is often referred to as the Dark Ages. The departure of the Romans created a void, and history has shown again and again that this is a dangerous phenomenon because the greedy and the ambitious tend to move in to fill those voids. You can tell this is a live video because we've now got roofers have moved next door and they're starting to work next to me, so I'm sorry for the occasional banging and bumping. 300 years after the events that I've just described, a man from the northeast, the Venerable Bede, wrote the first history of what had transpired. Without doubt, Bede's work was placed in a strong and subjective religious context, and his work would not be described today as history, but we should note that he may well have had access to manuscripts or materials that have been lost to us. But he tells us that when the Romans had left the country, southern England was ruled by a man named Vortigern, and he was under regular attack from heathen northern Picts. So he sought help from available European mercenaries. Bede suggests that hordes of men responded to that plea by sailing or rowing across the North Sea before landing on the coastal ranges of Kent and Essex. When Vortigern and the migrant warriors began to squabble and dispute their entitlements, Bede tells us that additional fleets of warriors arrived with the intention of colonising England. So again, there's a continuity of process here, following the Bronze and Iron Age settlers, the original Brits, the Celts, and now the Anglo Saxons. These hordes of new migrants were the people that we know as Anglo Saxons. Bede was in fact simplifying and summarising what was a lengthy and complex migration of tribes from northern Europe. The process would have continued over 2 or 3 centuries, and there was certainly never a single migration at one point in time. The invasions and colonisation were long drawn-out affairs, and changes in culture and particularly language were very gradual. Many tribes and races arrived in England at this time, and as you can see, this included the Frisians from the area we now know as the Netherlands. There were Flemings who occupied a region between Holland, Belgium and France. But the most dominant of people were the Angles, and they were from central and southern Denmark. The Saxons from what is now northern Germany, and Jutes from northern Denmark. What does become clear is that the seas and rivers were not barriers to these people. They were highways for skilled navigators. Rivers like the Humber, the Trent and the Thames allowed them to access the very heart of England. Although the written records are scarce, it is thought that native Britons and Celts resisted and fought those invaders. The migrant hordes pushed those ancient natives west into Wales and England's westerly coastal regions, where the natives eventually resettled and continued with their practices and, interestingly, their language. And so it is that the Welsh language is a derivative of that once used by our native Britons. And to this day, Cornish is one of England's oldest and most unusual dialects. It isn't possible to track and detail the finer routes taken by each and every one of the migrant tribes, but it is fair to say that the Angles settled predominantly in the Midlands and the east of England, whereas the Saxons and Jutes occupied the south and west of this country. County and regional names are quite an indication, because the tribes settled in places like Wessex and became known as the West Saxons. Similarly, Sussex for the South Saxons and Essex for the East Saxons. To a certain extent, we can follow some of the early routes taken by those people, because the migrants left a chain of cremation and burial sites on the south banks of the River Trent, for example, as they progressed westwards. Typically, there were stories, myths and legends about the fierce opposition which some of the native Britons enforced against the Anglo-Saxon migrations during the 5th and 6th centuries. The best known is probably the highly fantasised story of King Arthur, who supposedly battled the invaders from a fortress that was named Camelot. There is some evidence of a great battle at an unknown location named Mount Badon, because it was there that a leader known as Arthur defeated the raiders and stopped for a while their encroachment west. On arrival upon these shores, the tribal hordes were certainly pagan, and they worshipped gods like Tyr and Woden and Frey. And their names have been preserved, of course, in our days of the week. They often took advantage of existing Bronze Age, Iron Age and Roman fortifications, but they preferred to live in their own settlements. So you can see that once again there is an element of continuity here. Certainly central communal halls were a feature of Anglo-Saxon culture, and surviving poetry such as Beowulf confirms the significance of their great mead halls where psalms and tales were recited. Some early European manuscripts referred to England's new settlers as Angles, while others called them Saxons. But by the end of the 6th century, the country was being referred to as the Land of the Angles, or the Angle Land. The settlers created new regions, realms, and eventually kingdoms. Each acted totally independently under their own leaders, and between the 7th and 9th centuries there was an emergence of what have been known as the 7 kingdoms, which were dominant. And they were Kent, East Angles, Merthyr, Wessex, Sussex, Essex and Northumbria. Now, the boundaries between these regions were very fluid, and the extent and description of these regions has been debated by historians for decades, and they still are. So I can't be too hard and fast about where and when these realms began and ended. But I would like to finish this first clip with some words about some of those competing realms. And I'll start, of course, with Kent, which is certainly one of the oldest place names in English history. It was the very first region to be exposed to Christianity, and that became an important phenomenon, which I'll discuss a little bit later in the second clip. The Midland region of Mercia, where I sit today, was probably derived from their word Merse, meaning boundary folk. It was once a very powerful and dominant realm. In the year 757, King Offa succeeded to power there, and he was the man who introduced the penny coinage system. He was responsible also for constructing the remarkable 150-mile-long Offa's Dyke, which then marked the border between his realm and Wales. This outstanding structure stood 25 feet tall at some points, and it can still be seen very clearly amongst the beautiful landscapes. In the region of the East Angles, the dominant family were the Wuffings, spelt Wuffings. During the early 7th century, King Radwald ruled the region, and it is quite likely, but not certain, that the magnificent ship burial discovered in the late 1930s at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk contained the fabulous possessions and limited remains of this remarkable king. We know that Edmund was the last king of the East Angles. In the year 869 he was murdered, shot to death by arrows supposedly. And later he was buried in an Anglo Saxon settlement. Previously it had been named Biderisworth, but it was subsequently renamed, logically, Bury St Edmunds. This king was nominated a Christian martyr, and later he became a patron saint of his country. During the 7th and 8th centuries, Northumbria made a very significant cultural contribution to England and Europe via major centres of production in places like Whitby, Lindisfarne, and also in the twin monasteries at Jarrow. The glorious Lindisfarne Gospels were created around the year 715 to 720 on the site of the ancient monastery, the ruins of which can still be visited and seen. If you haven't had the opportunity to visit Lindisfarne and you are able, I would strongly recommend that you go. It is a truly remarkable, magical place, which is a significant part of our Anglo-Saxon past. Without doubt, it was Wessex that was the most impactful and ultimately successful of the disparate realms. It eventually absorbed all other regions and is best known, of course, for the reign of King Alfred, who ruled for 26 years from the year 871. This rather mystical realm incorporated historic sites and monuments at Stonehenge and Glastonbury Abbey. It was King Alfred who turned back the hordes of rapacious Vikings who had threatened to conquer all England until they were defeated by Alfred in May 878 at Edington in Wiltshire. I'm going to end the first clip at that point. In the second, I'll look at the developing unison between the disparate realms and the formation of the country we know as England. I hope you got something out of that first clip, and I look forward to you revisiting next time.